Okay, welcome back, everybody. It's 10:15. Let's go ahead and move on to our next item on today's agenda. We're going to get a presentation from Jason Gooden with council staff on Longfin Squid and Butterfish 2022 specifications review. So, Jason, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So again, we are reviewing first Longfin specs. The current ABC is 23,400. That was set for 2021 and 2023. Council can review that and change if warranted. A little table of how kind of the ABC breaks down into the IOI DHDAP, which is initial optimum yield, domestic annual harvest, domestic annual processing. Those are just kind of artifacts of how the plan developed over the years. And basically, it's just we take a bid out for discards based on recent observer data to get the quota. That IOI DHDAP, that's the quota. And that's further divided up into trimesters for Longfin Squid. And there's some rollover provisions that allow some degree of rollover amongst the trimesters. I just added, this is just kind of a refresher from last year. We had a stock assessment. And so where was Longfin in 2019? The purple line is really what's used to judge biomass. We had a few data gaps. That's why there are just some dots at the end there. The target is that gray dashed line and above that. There's no overfishing status for Longfin. We really don't have an accepted way to evaluate overfishing, fishing mortality. So from the fishery information document, just a review of landings and revenues. Landings down in 2020. Revenues, the orange dashed line, down even more, and the cause of that is the even more reduction in revenues because price was down also, and largely a COVID effect here. So just a path of the fishery the last couple of years. These are just the weekly quota monitoring reports. 2019 in the yellow orange, 2020 in blue. Again, so this is 2019, 2020. And you know, the course of landings through the year in these 2 years was pretty similar except for May and June. You can kind of see that gap starting with May 1, going through June, that gap grows. So landings in 2020 were slower in May and June than 2019. The rest of the year really kind of operated pretty similarly between the 2 years. This is just the first trimester of 2021 in blue, 2020 in the yellow orange now. So this year, 2021, starting off pretty slow, even compared to last year. And we just have a couple weeks of trimester 2 starting May 1, also pretty slow. That always the last terminal dot in these quota monitoring reports is usually a bit of an underreport just because of how the quota monitoring reports run. So the advisory panel with the fishery performance report included in the briefing documents, but just in terms of some highlights, the AP really has flagged that the restaurant closures and restaurant traffic really had to dramatically affect longfin demand and prices. They have had some mitigating retail sales to try to offset some of that a bit. And they've noted that kind of worldwide shipping and transport issues mean that it's hard to turn the flow of products that we're going into restaurants in some other direction, so that's kind of the just highlights in the fishery performance report. So Dr. Rago has a few highlights from the SSC meeting on their review of Longfin Squid ABC.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jason. Yeah, the SSC echoed the concerns that had been expressed earlier by both the assessment oversight panel and the reviewers for the management track assessment, in the sense that there is I think an underlying need for an improvement of the assessment model for Longfin Squid, particularly because of the there's evidence that there are cohorts that have differing levels of productivity, and that these are fished by different spatial units, so that something that actually has accommodates these known biological differences would be an important way of advancing the management of this resource. Right now the trimester program really addresses the the inshore versus offshore production differences through temporal aliasing, so to speak. But one way to address that, and because it has so many knock-on effects in terms of management, is that it really does need a benchmark assessment, which is currently scheduled for 2026. There was some concerns expressed by the SSC that moving that before 2026 would be beneficial, recognizing, of course, that's a heavy piece of furniture to be moved around. The SSC noted again a kind of a pervasive theme of the consequences of offshore wind, and its consequences for fishing in known spawning areas and so forth. But the bottom line from the SSC was that based on the information available to it and the reports from industry, that there were no compelling evidence to recommend changes from the previously agreed upon ABC of 23,400 metric tons. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so just kind of coming back to where we are with specs right now, the monitoring committee also met and reviewed the same information, and monitoring committee recommends that changes do not appear warranted at this time. I just copied and pasted that table again, and so just pause now for questions on this, and no action is needed unless decided as warranted by council. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Jason, and thanks, Paul, for your presentation. Does anyone have any questions for Jason on Longfin? Any comments? It seems pretty straightforward. There's no action needed at this time, but I just want to offer an opportunity for council members to ask questions based on the presentation. Is there anyone from the public that would like to ask any questions of Jason or Paul? Okay, I don't see anything at this time, Jason and Paul. Doesn't seem to be any questions. With no action needed on Longfin, I think we can move on to Butterfish, if you're okay with that.
Yep, I will pull up the Butterfish presentation momentarily.
All right, take your time.
Okay, I think I'm good. Mary, just standard presentation view up.
Looks
Yeah,
good.
it looks good to me. It looks
Okay,
good.
thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on mute. Thanks, Jason.
Okay,
The floor is yours.
thank you. Okay, So with Butterfish, we're also in multi-year specs for 2020, 2021, and the ABC is projected to increase from 2021 to 2022. That's just based on council risk policy. We had an assessment last year, and just applying the council's risk policy. One thing I will mention is that these projections didn't use the full recruitment time series, just more recent 10 years because recruitment's been lower, and touch on that a bit again later. No, again, we're in a review process here. So these are the overall specs tables, and at the top you can see that change in OFL drives change in the ABC. Again, the ABC is lower than the OFL because of the council risk policy. The stock was not overfished, but below its target. So you get some reductions because of that. There's some a management uncertainty buffer, several steps of reducing the available quota for discards in fairly precautionary way. And at the end, you get to really that directed fishery all the way at the bottom. So it was about a bit over 5,000 metric tons in 2021, projected to go to about 10,500 metric tons in 2022. Again, just reviewing from last year, you can see the biomass trend here has been down. F, while increasing, still only like a quarter of the reference point. So while that trend looks higher, it's still relatively low, but it's been increasing because catch has been increasing a bit and biomass has been decreasing. So F going up, and so why is the stop going down if F is low while its recruitment has been low? And that was part of the reason why there's SSC discussion, and then discussion with the assessment oversight panel about, does it make sense to use this whole time series of recruitment or just a more recent 10 years? The ultimate decision was to only draw from recruitments from 2010 on, since we seem to be in a relatively low recruitment regime. So that is a bit of extra precaution built in terms of projections, because we're not thinking that we might get these very high recruitments when the projections are running and drawing. They're only drawing from since 2010, a relatively low stanza of recruitment. So from the fishery information document, just landings and revenues here, landings in solid blue, revenues dotted orange. Kind of some fits and starts since the fishery has been reopened, generally increasing trend, which is kind of what the AP, kind of suggested back in the day would happen. They didn't expect a dramatic immediate ramp up in this fishery, just given limited demand. Prices, trends, down a bit in 2020 from 2019. These are in 2020 dollars, inflation adjusted, but not a whole lot different from recent years. Fishery performance report, AP just kind of relayed that demand was more or less status quo outside of general COVID disruptions. Still kind of limited interest in this fishery, and flagged that sometimes in the areas where they'd like to fish, where they have a sense that there's bigger butterfish, that sometimes the areas are just covered up with dogfish, and makes the areas unfishable. So again, I'll turn to Dr. Rago for a summary of the SSC's thoughts on the Butterfish ABC.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The SSC expressed some items of concern. As Jason noted, the biomass has been declining and recruitment has been low since '99. The stock biomass, however, remains above the BMSY level due to low fishing mortality. As Jason noted, even the F of 0.2 is relatively low for this short-lived species. And also, the stock biomass is projected to increase due to some of the changes between 2020 and 2021. So, we do expect it to increase even under the assumption of using the low stanza of recent recruitment. So, as Jason noted, this is a fairly practical assessment process that does embed contemporary metrics of stock status, as well as likely trends in recruitment, whatever may be driving those trends. The SSE at the end of the day concluded that a quota reduction was not necessary for 2022. First of all, it's above BMSY. The quota, the removals for 2020 are likely to be biased high, suggesting that there probably is a slightly lower F than estimated. The industry indicated that there's probably no chance of exceeding the quota in 2021. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the research track assessment for Butterfish will be available for use by the SSC in 2022. So the SSC expressed the concern that trends in abundance should be monitored closely, particularly since all of them tend to be in the downward direction. But there's no compelling evidence to reject the previously approved ABC for 2022. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
So taking the SSC's input and the AP and general fishery information document, the monitoring committee concluded that specifications do not appear warranted at this time. So again, can take questions. No action is needed. There's one little mesh requirement issue that's separate, and but I'll pull slides up on that after the council kind of deals with specifications themselves. Thanks. Mike, you might be muted.
No, I just was, I had to wake my mouse up here.
Yep.
And get things going. So yeah, thanks for your presentation, Jason and Paul. I was a little concerned about some of the graphs that you showed about the low harvest at this point. Is that just a market? I asked the question to Jessica earlier. Is it just a market demand with COVID and other issues like that? Is that where?
I mean, I think just general market demand, looking at kind of the history of this fishery. There was this kind of niche market going into Japan that kind of dried up. So there's, I think it's just back when the council started increasing specifications, and the quotas in a lot of those years, even with catch going up, were still substantially above the landings. So it's not kind of a new thing that landings are a good bit below the quota. I mean, AP members at the time kind of said they don't expect kind of this fishery to take off given the general limited demand for butterfish. So anyway, that's my sense of things.
Yeah, and I guess one of the questions that I had, I don't know much about this fishery as far as having to deal with it in my own home state. But is this fishery more? Is it a food fishery, or is it more of a bait fishery? I know butterfish are used for bait, but is it like what's the majority? Where are the majority of the fish going? You made a point that a lot of it was going over to to Japan, and maybe that's dried up at this point. But do we feel like there's something we can still do with this fishery to make it profitable for folks that are engaged in it, even though the catches are low?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's traditionally it certainly was a food fishery. Then the fishery, and I'll go back to the fishery kind of dried up by its own accord. And you can see this spike in landings in 2001. The fishery had trouble getting rid of those 2001 butterfish, and really had trouble selling them. Then the fishery was kind of locked down when we thought it was overfished. Of course, the new assessment said not only is it not overfished, it was never overfished, but the initial kind of decline there was just a fishery of its own accord. The market's drying up. I think most, there may be some industry participants on the call who would have kind of more impact, a better view of kind of where they see this going.
Sure.
But I think just, general competition, there may be some other, kind of related species that compete in the market. Also, I think they probably would say, this fishery is going to kind of do what it does based on, year-to-year availability and market demand, and they hope to grow it, but it's probably not going to take off like, incredibly fast.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Jason. I appreciate that. Just more information for me to process. All right, let me go. I'm going to stay with the council at this point. Greg, we'll come to you in a minute. Let me start with Peter Defer, and then Greg. If you keep your hand up, that's fine. I'll call on you in just a second. But go ahead, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Jason and Paul. I'm curious if there's any theory about why recruitment has been declining for so long.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think there have been any ecological, change in forage length and composition or anything like that may be driving it. I would hesitate to offer any speculation without talking to the assessment team, or perhaps somebody else may know of some underlying factor. But this, to the best of my knowledge, we're not. That this is puzzling.
Thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Has there been any documented change in the distribution of the stock? I mean, are we looking at the population expanding its area, moving offshore, north, south, not west?
I apologize. I'm not familiar with whether there has been a distributional shift of significance on that. Perhaps Jason would know, but I apologize for not knowing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of like a centroid analysis, and not that I'm directly aware of it. And I think when you look at catches in the survey, they tend to be, pretty widely distributed. But I can, I can ping the assessment lead as a follow-up question to see if he has any thoughts on it, and follow up offline.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to note, Chuck Adams is one of his specialties is spatial analysis. So I'm sure if there is any pattern there that he has investigated it. So thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, we can follow up. Jason and Paul can work to get a follow up for you, Peter, on that. I see Sonny Gwynn with his hand up. Sonny?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, my question is on permitting. Is this an open access fishery? Is it what's the history in the on the access to this fishery?
Yeah, I think it was originally tied up, I think, and might have Garfo just weigh in or confirm. Originally, it was tied to Longfin, but then in the Longfin permit action was split out into its own permit. I think all the existing permits were retained. There was no requalification. So I think everyone who had a Longfin Butterfish moratorium permit still has one of those, but it is limited access currently. And Garfo can correct me if I'm wrong.
So Jason, you had to qualify in a in the past, and now it's limited access. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in the distant past, yes.
Okay. Sonny, does that help you out? Do you have a follow-up, Sonny? Or are you good?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Yes, I was just wondering why it was like that. If there was no interest in the fishery, is what I was hearing. Why it was closed access.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the history of this fishery. Maybe that's something that we can follow up with you. Maybe Garfo can follow up. I don't want to put them on the spot. I mean, if Garfo has something they want to comment on, that's great. I don't see any hands coming up at this time, but Sonny, maybe it's something we can follow up with council staff and Garfo about, just to get you a little bit more of the history.
And it's I mean, a bit of a speculation, but I'm guessing when the council originally did it for Longfin, Longfin was, may have been more of a concern in terms of, and it was bundled with Longfin.
Okay.
When the council requalified and reduced the number of Longfin permits, did not requalify or reduce the number of Butterfish permits. Everyone who had that permit maintained it. So I think there's probably about 350 to 400 moratorium Butterfish permits out there. Ballparking just based on my memory from that action. And again, Butterfish landings were higher in the past. So that, I think, I think Longfin, it was coupled to Longfin given the interactions in the fishery. I'm guessing Longfin was probably the primary concern there. And then it's just been that way ever since.
Okay.
But there is a bit
All right,
of
thanks,
speculation, kind of historic speculation on my part going on there. So we can follow up on some of that history a little bit for something later.
Okay. Yeah. Does that work for you, Sonny? We'll follow up later on that.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, next I have Eric Reed with his hand up. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to answer, I can answer your question. The winter fishery for Butterfish, which was the primary fishery, the most landings came out of the winter period, was built on the world market for food. And I believe that the main destination for Butterfish still is food. There is a bait market, of course, but the main driver is the food market. And protein is a worldwide market and subject to supply, demand, and price, and Butterfish is no different there. So if the supply from somewhere else is of a cheaper price, then guess what? You can go fishing for them, but you better prepare to put them in inventory in the freezer and sell out of the freezer. So hopefully that answers your question. And as far as recruitment goes, it's my opinion, I'm obviously not a scientist, but young of the year don't seem to be moving out of their hatching grounds like they used to. Fish don't come out of Narragansett Bay or Buzzards Bay or Long Island Sound like they used to. They hang out there a lot longer now, and they may not be exposed to the surveys in a timely fashion to show up in those surveys. But, the water's a little warmer now, so they stay inside and don't move until much later in the year than they used to. So it's very possible, in my opinion, that the surveys are missing young of the year because they just haven't moved into the survey areas. So that's it.
All right, thanks, Eric. Thanks for that insight. Is there anyone else from the council that has any questions for Jason or Paul? Anyone from the audience have any questions? Anyone from the public? Okay, seeing no hands. Jason, you have the mesh requirement issue next. Why don't we do that, since it doesn't seem like there's any action that's necessary, or there's no interest in any action at this time on Butterfish specs. Do you want to get into the mesh requirement? And then we'll
Sure.
wrap things up. Yeah.
And just circling back to one thing that I think Peter asked about recruitment. I mean, I think one tricky thing that we seem to be seeing is, lower recruitment across a number of kind of these species, mackerel, I think herring also. We did get one AP comment kind of noting concern about, is there kind of an across the board kind of recruitment issue with, some of these related 4G type species. But again, I don't have anything specific, but there's definite concern about that. Okay, so the mesh requirement. There was, so the council kind of wanted to look at some, related to the executive order on seafood competitiveness. Are there some things going on that might, be ripe for kind of fixing? And so as within staff, as we kind of brainstorm some things, staff noted that there had been some AP concern in the past that the 3-inch mesh requirement to retain more than 5,000 pounds of butterfish could cause some regulatory discarding. I wouldn't say it was like a strong concern raised by the AP, but it has come up in some years. The original 3-inch mesh requirement, when the fishery kind of, the quota was increased to allow it, I think there was general, we had some input from industry that they could kind of live with a 3-inch mesh for targeting, hopefully to try to, eliminate some retention of some small butterfish that are going to end up discarded. So took another look at this based on some recent observer data, focusing on longfin squid trips, since they tend to run into butterfish a good bit. It doesn't really appear to be substantial at this time based on those observed longfin trips. Catches higher than 5,000 pounds appear infrequent in the observer data, and almost all the discards that are being reported as market driven, and not some kind of regulatorily induced discarding event. So certainly, I think can continue to monitor this, but monitoring committee recommended no changes for this measure at this time, especially with a butterfish research track amendment underway. So I'll pause again. There's no action needed on this. It was just kind of a to-do task for the year related to that. And again, the monitoring committee is recommending no action at this time.
All right, thanks, Jason. Does anyone have any questions for Jason regarding the mesh issue? Anyone from the public with any questions? Okay, seeing no hands at this time, I think we've completed this item on the agenda. Jason, is there anything else that needs to come before the council at this time?
Not for Longfin Squid or Butterfish.
Okay. All right, great. So you're up next again, on Illex. Let's, we'll take another 5 minutes. Everyone stretch their legs and get some coffee or whatever you need. We'll come back at 10:55 and we'll pick up. We're ahead of schedule, which is good. We'll go ahead and take the next agenda item, and then we'll take a lunch break after that. And we'll work through the afternoon session. You know, Chris, normally it's easy to lean over to Chris and ask what he thinks about staying on track. Chris, do you have any thoughts about if we're ahead of schedule? Do you want to just continue to go through the agenda, even though it was announced as is? Or, I mean, are you okay with kind of starting things up earlier than they're expected?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Are you talking about having lunch earlier and then?
No, I'm saying, you know, if, you know, the next agenda item isn't supposed to start until 11:30, it's
Oh.
only 10:50. And if we took a lunch and we came back at 12:45 instead of 1:30, do you think there are going to be people who might be disappointed because they thought it was going to be 1:30, but the meeting could be over by the time they come online based on what we announced? I'm looking for some advice on how I mean, we're ahead of schedule, which is fine, but how do we is it better to stay on track or just continue through?
I think if folks know us and know the way that we work through our schedules, if we start something early, I mean, we've done it before, and it says, you know, we have a disclaimer at the bottom of our agendas and our notices that might happen. So I think if in fact we get done early with Illex, then it looks like we'll probably be right around lunchtime anyway.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I would just break for lunch after Illex, and then we have unmanaged commercial landings starting at 1:30. Let's see how long Illex goes. I think that there might be some folks that would be disappointed if you know, they tuned in at 1:30 and we had started at 1 and we're done with that particular topic. So I think that let's see how long Illex lasts.
Okay.
And then,
All right. Yeah.
see
Let's break. Actually, let's break until 11. Let's give everybody a few minutes to go get themselves ready, and we'll start up at 11 o'clock on Illex, and then we'll just we'll reconsider depending on how that conversation goes. So let's all meet back at 11 o'clock. Thanks. I appreciate that, Chris. Thanks. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Our next item on the agenda, we're going to talk about Illex Squid 2021 and 2022 specs. Jason's going to give us a presentation, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments after the presentation. So, Jason, if you're ready to go, it's all you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, so we have two kind of separate topics. One, the specifications, the other, some control date considerations. Let's kind of take them separately. Within the specs, also have a discussion of a triplement issue, and we'll kind of subdivide that as well. And take a pause for potential council action at a couple spots. So Illex specs, we're currently at 30,000 metric ton ABC for 2021. It's set for 2022. Because of kind of how the regs are for Illex, we can modify 2021. The current ABC was generated to the SSC's May 2020 review of the council's quota work group products. That work group has, as its own work group, has been fairly quiet since. Kind of some of the efforts have rolled in, and many of the same people are involved in the Illex research track assessment, and also kind of one of the main medium-term tasks that was kind of next on the block from the work group's perspective was some environmental analyses that are being worked on at the center. And I think once those are available, that Council's quota work group will probably spin up again and see if some of those environmental analyses kind of might suggest something, and how exactly how it aligns and intermixes with the assessment is we'll just have to kind of work through that. But so there's an EA, draft EA, kind of with an ongoing proposed rule for current year MSV specs. It just took a while to get those specs out. Not much was changing of consequence, so there wasn't a huge rush. But that EA did explore a wider range for Illex specs of 20,000 to 40,000 metric tons. It doesn't say that 20,000 is acceptable or 40,000 is acceptable. It just more explores, other impacts, habitat, protected resources, et cetera. So if the SSC changes from the 30, which we'll discuss they have, it allows some more flexibility. And we'll kind of get into that a bit. Again, I mentioned the research track assessment is ongoing. Council staff did ask Dr. Rago to refine some of last year's analyses. A few months ago, kind of pondering where we were with Illex, and might there be something that we could do in the meantime while we're still waiting for the research track assessment. Dr. Rago, under contract, did kind of review some of his analyses. John Manderson and some folks also refined some spatial analyses. So those, plus the typical info doc and fishery performance report, no 2020 survey data because of COVID, but those are kind of the things feeding into the process here. So again, from that, we'll hit some of those things as we go, and Dr. Rago will. But from the fishery information document, 2020 was another very strong year of landings. Price was down a bit, so revenues were down a bit, although landings really at an all-time high. Again, price per metric ton was down in 2020, so that's why those revenues are down a bit, even though landings are up a bit. 2019 to 2020. Again, price trends here, those are all adjusted for inflation to kind of apples to apples 2020 dollars. So there's just fishery performance report week to week, 2019 in yellow orange, 2020 in blue. This is, again, last year is blue, the year before orange. Pretty similar performances from my perspective. Started a bit later and was closed pretty close to the quota there. So this is just current fishery monitoring. What went to the SSC? We didn't have, the fishery really hadn't started yet. We're basically running that last data point is probably will pop up a bit once more fuller reporting comes in. Basically seem to be running about 2 weeks ahead of last year so far this year. But again, we're just kind of right at the start of the fishery. But it looks like, again, landings are running about a week or two ahead of last year so far this year. So for the Illex fishery performance report, the input we got was not much different from last year. Industry is really anticipating the assessment results and the rulemaking for the Illex permit action from last year. And just update, Illex permit action is kind of just going through the standard GARFA review. We'll have a proposed rule coming up, but neither one of those will affect 2021. And just kind of they continue to flag, it's kind of a mix of world supply and demand, local availability, cost of the input, especially fuel, and regulations kind of just drive landings year to year. They also flagged that the early shutdowns kind of mean our picture of Illex sizes. They generally increase in size through the year. and really the potential productivity of the stock is incomplete because we've been closing it in recent years. So I'll turn to Dr. Rago now for some input from the SSC.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I just wanted to, before I begin, I wanted to clarify my role in all of this. As Jason noted, I do have a contract with the council for work that is done as part of the council's quota working group. I also am on the research track assessment, although that is not a compensated position. But in order to prevent any kind of conflict of interest, and just so everyone knows, this part of the assessment in terms of the SSC deliberations where I recused myself from chairing the meeting and also asked Mike Wilberg, the co-chair, to serve as chair during this exercise. And as well, the species lead for this. The species lead for Illex on the SSC, Tom Miller, Dr. Tom Miller, led this discussion. Secondly, there are about 5 pages of discussion about the work that Dr. John Manderson did and myself, and presentations to the council as well as public comments. Those are in the SSC report. I won't be touching on those now. Instead, I'll be restricting my comments to the work of the SSC and its deliberations that led to these conclusions. So how did they address the terms of reference as specified, and what were the primary conclusions? The report itself fleshes out many of these details, and we'll touch on some of those issues tomorrow during my presentation of the SSC itself. So this is all preamble to what we're going to be talking about, and also just for the sake of both the completeness and attention to the detail, I've included pretty much the verbatim summaries of the conclusions, dropping a few words here and there, clauses that were necessary. So just so you know that this pretty much is a reflection of the text as summarized in the report of the SSC. So the first question was to review the appropriateness of the staff recommendation to raise the quota from 30,000 to 33,000 metric tons for both 2021 and 2022. And then the term of reference was, whether this this revised quota of 33,000 metric tons is inappropriate or not, and what might a more appropriate one be. So we begin with the response of the SSC. There is no OFL or FMSY proxy, but the SSC reviewed the work that was presented to it and summarized in working papers, and accepted this ad hoc approach for recommending it. Based on the evidence presented, the patterns suggest an increase in abundance, low levels of exploitation, and noted, of course, that the catches have been constrained by ABCs for the last 4 years. So with those kinds of information and the analysis, the SSC concluded that the Illex stock is at a high level of abundance and experiencing low exploitation. The risk policy is also somewhat problematic in the sense that we really don't know the overall status of the resource in terms of its relationship to a BMSY, and so. But there are, of course, indications that the stock is at a high level of abundance, and so. While we await the results of the research track assessment, the SSC concluded that setting the ABC as at a provisional level of 33,000 metric tons was consistent with the likelihood that Illex are at a high level of abundance and experiencing a low rate of exploitation. So, and that it appears that this ABC is not in conflict with the Council's risk policy. So the recommendation then is to revise the ABC to 33,000 metric tons for both 2021 and for 2022, and that this will be conditional to some extent on the potential revisions that might occur as we improve our understanding through the research track assessment. So next slide, please. Thank you, Jason. The second term of reference was, what can we do in the intermediate period here in terms of monitoring the resource and making any recommendations or changes for 2022. As before, we will continue each year to update our and review the information available on not only the current years, but also on previous years' recommendations. So that is just part of the normal SSC process. But, of course, the main things to monitor in the meantime are the pattern and distribution of landings during the upcoming fishing season and the pattern and distribution of the survey results. The SSC recommended further analyses on a wider range of ABC specifications, and that topic will be addressed in more detail tomorrow under the discussion of the SSC other business, and so there's a more complete description of that this particular issue. But essentially, it noted that the SSC noted that it wasn't really possible to evaluate other higher ABCs than 33,000 to see whether they would also be compliant with the risk policy. So this was, the one that was recommended under the terms of reference is the one that was evaluated, but the SSC would have appreciated, a further examination of this risk of alternative of values. So and then the final term of reference. Next slide, please. This one describes both term of reference 3 and 4, 3 and 5, excuse me. Number 4 is just, what information did you review and look at? But, in this case, it is important to highlight, what we don't know about the Illex resource and of course, it's overall distribution and magnitude of the resource is poorly defined. I mean, we see that fraction of the resource that comes onto the shelf during its life history. We don't know what fraction that is per se. We think that because of distributional patterns and other incidental survey observations that we are basically seeing a relatively small fraction of the resource in any given year. But as a result of this being an open population, there really isn't any true estimate of biomass or exploitation rate. We get into the ballpark, and most of the analyses that I did and others have done gets you some idea of what ballpark we are in. Whether it's, anyhow, won't extend that metaphor, the ballpark, spare you that. The variation in availability versus variation in abundance is not truly known. So, and again, noted that a 40% escapement policy. That is, you compare what the residual biomass would have been had it been subject only to a natural mortality. So you compare what was with what would have been. That gives you your percent escapement. We really don't know whether that policy is sufficient for Illex squid. It is a policy that has been used in other fisheries around the world, squid fisheries around the world. So it's not totally without foundation, but it is unknown as to whether it is sufficient for that. There is a lack of understanding in terms of what governs migration into and out of the area where squid are available, Illex are available to the fishery and to the surveys. And so, there's a role in which the work of the research track assessment and to some extent the oceanographic working group will definitely have some bearing on improving that understanding and perhaps improving subsequent management of this. So, notwithstanding all of these concerns, sources of uncertainty, and the long discussions we had on this topic, the SSC concluded that the recommendations that were based on the best scientific information available. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, turn it back over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I think it highlights a lot of the challenges of managing a stock where we don't have an assessment. Hopefully we're moving to a better point. Since a little more discussion here, Chairman Luisi, do you want to just pause for questions for Paul before I push on, since there's a little more information here than than Longfin Butterfish?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that, Jason. If there are questions for Paul or Jason based on what we've heard so far, I'm happy to take those questions at this point. I see Katie Almeida, but let me hold off on Katie. I see Michelle Duvall's hand up. Let's stay with the council at this point, and Katie, I'll come to you in a second. Michelle, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think just with respect to, the SSC noting that it wasn't possible to evaluate, additional ABCs because there was only one analysis provided. I mean, do we need to structure the terms of reference a little differently to allow for the SSC to potentially examine additional ABCs? I realize it's a little bit of an ignorant question. I apologize for that.
Well, Paul, do you want to speak to that? I mean, I think there's some information in the SSC report on that topic that I imagine you might touch in more detail tomorrow, but you're probably best to address that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the question, Michelle. Yes, I think it basically boils down to restructuring of the terms of reference. And had there been a more formal, or had it been within the term of reference to explore a broad range of potential quotas that could have been done as part of this exercise. The 33,000 alternative was chosen as sort of an interim step in lieu of the research track assessment. The scope of the analyses that were undertaken essentially addressed the problem from sort of multiple perspectives or multiple facets of it. And what we attempted to do was to say, under various procedural, various modeling approaches, each one of them suggested minimal risk. We didn't extend that analysis to say, under all that scope of models, what would the sort of threshold level of risk be for potential future consequences for the resource. And so I'll elaborate a little bit more on that tomorrow as we get into that discussion about the SSC concerns. But you're correct that the first remedy, if you will, would have been perhaps a more detailed exploration of both higher and lower quotas. Thank you.
Michelle, did you have a follow-up on that?
No, just thank you to Dr. Rago, and apologies if I sort of blow over into the discussion that we'll have tomorrow after he presents his report, but definitely appreciate the response. So thanks.
Oh yeah, no problem at all. Thank you. It's good to soften the beach, before we talk about that one.
Yeah, and don't ever feel like you need to apologize, Michelle. Every question's a good question. The question, I guess, to Paul, based on terms of reference, we go through a process of approving the terms of reference, and you work closely with Brandon and me and Chris. If there are terms of reference that we need to consider updating or modifying, I would look to you to have that discussion with the SSC and with Brandon and with staff in moving forward. If you think there's something else that we can explore that would, I'm just listening to the conversation and trying to figure out, how we can do things better. I don't know, Paul, if you have any thoughts on that or.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I obviously want a continual process of improvement in terms of how we deal with the needs and requests from the council. In this case, if I may apologize, it was sort of an oversight in terms of not fully understanding or recognizing that the SSC would want to explore more than the two alternatives that were presented to it, the 30,000 and the 33,000 metric tons. So, that point was driven home fairly strongly in our discussions. So, hopefully that point, as well as others that where we may hit some road bumps, or speed bumps, will be ones that I will take into consideration as we move forward. So
okay, it's great. That's great to hear. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate that. I have a few other hands. Jason, I'm going to go to you first, and then I have Eric Reed and Dewey Himmelwright. So go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, and I think it's also good to kind of keep the context in mind that we're trying to investigate some kind of interim stopgap measures while the assessment was proceeding, and without having an assessment, and yet Paul almost kind of doing a pseudo assessment for us. So it is kind of a unique situation, but still I think warrants additional discussion of terms of reference that will happen. But it is kind of a relatively unique kind of situation that in terms of the context.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jason. Terms of reference, it's the kind of thing where it kind of becomes standard, but as we need to make adjustments, I think it's important that the SSC and staff and leadership on the council make sure they understand where we're going And if changes need to be made and additions need to be made, I'm happy with that. It's just we need to pay attention and focus on what needs to be what changes need to be included in the terms of reference. So thanks, Jason, for that. I've got a couple hands up at this time. Let's go to Eric Reed next, and then Dewey, you'll be after Eric. Go ahead, Eric. If you're talking, Eric, we can't hear you. You're probably on mute.
Okay, how about now?
There you go. I can hear you now.
Okay, great. I would love to engage into a discussion about the terms of reference, especially term of reference 2, bullets 2 through 4. But since this is only the preamble, I'll wait. But my question is to Dr. Rago, since a primary driver in Illex is escapement, could you remind me what the fishing footprint in what is known as NAFO areas 5 and 6, which is where we fish? What's the fishing footprint versus the actual habitat of Illex by percentage? And could you also maybe remind me of what the escapement is, if you base it on landings in areas 3 and 4, what the escapement is on the TAC in that area? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Eric. The overlap between the fishery footprint and the area in which Illex are caught is very small. It's less than 2%, and probably under like 1.5%, somewhere in that neighborhood there. So overall, there's a relatively small area in which fishing activity occurs. It does occur in areas where the Illex are more abundant within that overall distribution. A little analysis that I did suggested that the abundance in the areas where the fishing occurs are about 8 times higher than the abundance in areas outside the fishing zone. That is, as fishermen know, there are concentrations that occur along the shelf break, which are the primary fishing areas. So the percent overlap in and of itself is significant, and also suggests there is escapement in areas where they may be concentrated, but they're not available due to one or more factors, such as a galvanized jungle below of fixed gear, or monument areas, or other areas that may be too far from port to make them economically valuable. So the percentage overlap is important. It's a necessary component, but it's not sufficient for understanding the magnitude of fishing mortality per se. The second point, in terms of what the percent escapement was or has been or would be projected under various quotas, wasn't analyzed as part of the papers considered, documents considered by the SSC. In those analyses, it's on average, it's well above 40% historically, and it remained above, even if you took the historical record of surveys and superimposed an alternative history of 30,000 metric tons per year or 33,000 metric tons per year. The information suggests that only under the most extreme assumptions about fishing mortality rates would there have been a problem. So in a nutshell, the analysis suggests that escapement would have been high even under the record of alternative abundance estimates from the surveys over time. So I think I've answered your question, but maybe in If
You
not,
did.
please. Okay,
Make it
Thank
easy. You did.
okay, thank you.
All right, thanks for that, everyone. Dewey, I have you next with your hand up. Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this question might be for Jason. I was curious, is there any analysis that's been done on the size of the squid that are caught in the fishery, similar to like the catch of the golden tilefish in the golden tile fishery, where certain size squid are segmented throughout the year, like how many millions of pounds of 80-gram squids caught or something like that, just to give an idea of the catch. And another question would be, what size is the start of this fishery? What size squid is caught that enters into the fishery, maybe? Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, we have done some size analyses, and I think there are some ongoing with the assessment. I think this might be a follow-up. I think in general, since as the size is increasing through the year, I know sometimes some of the processors will try to hold back the fishery a bit early on to try to some of the processors to try to kind of focus on larger squid. But in terms of the details of that, I'm going to have to I'll add that to my follow-up task list. Unless, I don't know if Paul, if you have any thoughts on that off the top of your head based on some of the work that's been done over the last year or two.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. We have obviously looked at the size composition of the biological samples that are reported, and particularly helpful has been a long-term record of biological samples from industry. I think ultimately they may be really one of the primary keys for unlocking the within season dynamics of the resource, and therefore adjusting catch accordingly. As far as culling in terms of potentially discarding, I would defer to any reports from the observer program on that aspect. In terms of culling with respect to market classifications or selling classifications, if you will, I would ask perhaps industry can refine that aspect. To the best of my knowledge, landings are reported by dealers as unclassified. So they may be sold on the basis of size, but in terms of reporting, they are currently reported by as unclassified. So
Yeah, can I have a follow-up with Mike?
Yeah, go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, I wasn't asking about the discarding or whatever. I was just asking what size squid starts out the season of catching, and just looking at the overall, the squid are sold by different sizes. I just wondered how it's recorded, and like if you took the quota and it was divvied up in size class, what would it be? And because it's my thought that they grow a certain size throughout the time period, and I was just curious at what size. I would tend to think that a larger size brings more money, and I was just curious when industry starts on what size. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, they're good. Thanks. I think they start out about 50 grams and go up to about 200, which is what Jason is showing here. And that there are, a strong seasonality to that. That decline that you see as the season progresses. This is week within years on the x-axis there. That decline is it's not that they're shrinking, of course, it's that there's probably some recruitment coming in, and also these are typically vessels that are fishing, outside some prime areas. So overall, that seasonal pattern of growth, particularly as it increases from 50 to 200 or so, is really one of the primary signals as to whether we're going to have a good year or a bad year in terms of overall landing. Some years that it just is kind of flat, which reflects a whole mixture of underlying factors, whether it's changes in recruitment, slower growth rates, immigration of larger fish out of the area. There's a whole suite of hypotheses that might explain that. So thank you, Jason, for adding that so quickly.
Anything else, Dewey, as a follow-up on that?
No, sir, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, thanks for that question. I'm going to go next to Peter Hughes. Go ahead, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Dr. Rago, this has to do with the escapement question we heard earlier, and I'm sorry if I was scrolling through and did not hear the answer. Looking through documents, I was trying to pull up the SSC report from our most recent meeting, and there's a sentence in there that says that analysis of the spatial footprint of the commercial fishery from VTR records from 2008 to 2019 suggests that fishing activity occurs in less than 1.2% of the habitat area. So am I to infer from that in that date range that 98.8% of the area could be chalked up to escapement? Or am I inferring that completely incorrectly?
No, I think your inference is absolutely spot on correct. 98% of the area is in fact not available or has escapement occurring into it. However, it doesn't necessarily translate to 98% of the stock being in the area having escapement, because the differential between the densities in the area fished versus the density of the stock in the areas unfished is ultimately the factor that's related to how much of the resource is escaping at any given time. Now, that being said, there's a pretty high likelihood that a large fraction of the resource is not being exploited by the current fishery. However, we still don't know, what the mechanism for on-shelf migration is. There may be some instances, or we don't know whether it's if you think of it like a river system, or we're fishing a pipe where they're all coming through one port and they're through one area, or are they coming in as a wave, hitting all areas simultaneously. Obviously, those are two extreme assumptions there, but right now we don't have enough information to really identify which one is or where on the spectrum we might reside. But I think as the SSC summarized, that all of the evidence when taken in aggregate suggests that escapement is high, and that the stock size is lightly exploited.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you helping me to better understand that sentence in the report. So thank you, Doctor.
Paul.
All right, thanks, Peter. Thanks, Paul, for that exchange. Are there any other questions at this time? Katie Almeida? Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead to the audience. Go ahead, Katie.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Thank you. Sorry to go all the way back to this, but I think Michelle Duval pretty much asked my question, but I just wanted to clarify. For the range of ABCs to be analyzed, am I correct in that I heard that it needs to be specifically mentioned in the terms of references in order for that to be done?
Yes, it would have, I guess, the normal process is to say, okay, we have an OFL, and within that, there are a range of possible ABCs, the ABC being less than or equal to the OFL. And typically that is derived in more or less of a sequential fashion in which you consider the risk policy and the consequences of alternative levels for achievement of an acceptable level of risk. In this instance, the recommendation was to look at an ABC of 30 or 33,000 metric tons as a potential value and evaluate its risk directly. So there wasn't a sort of process associated with the normal procedure of moving from the OFL to an ABC. The SSC felt that this was constraining, and so if we were to advance a similarly structured term of reference in the future, that it would be restricted to a it would encompass a sort of range of values, and then perhaps structured to say what where does for lack of a better metaphor, where does the magnitude of the removals cause concern or cause you to wince? But that's not how this one was structured, and so because the SSC needs to adhere to their terms of reference in terms of the debate, and also rely on evidence and presentation to make the arguments. It was not part of the deliberations, nor could it be part of the conclusions of the SSC. I hope that answers sort of the sort of structural. It's an important procedural detail.
Nope, that answers it perfectly. I just hope moving forward we can change that so we can get a range of ABCs to analyze. So I know at one of those Illex working groups, a couple of people had spoken up asking for consideration of a different ABC. And as we all know now, we couldn't do that. So I just hope to see that change in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks, Paul, for your response. I have a couple other hands from the audience. I'm going to go next to James Fletcher, and then Greg DiDomenico, you're on deck. Go ahead, James.
Hopefully I'm coming in. Dr. Rego, the NAFO has information outside of 200 miles, and we have information roughly from the 100 Phantom Edge in. There is a space between the two areas where we have no information about the biomass, should we do something to estimate the biomass in the areas from where we sample to the 200 Phantom Edge? What can the SSC do to estimate that range? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, James. Yeah, there is information available. NAFO, of course, as you know, it does have it relies on surveys that are conducted in NAFO Area 3, NLO, and also in 4T, which is the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then also in 4VWX, which is basically Nova Scotia. And in each of those areas, there is monitoring of the presence of Illex, and there has of course been in the NAFO report for the 2019 report, which was published in 2020, it did note that there was a higher level of productivity evidenced in the 4VWX assessment. So you know, it does address the shelf related surveys to some extent. The Area 3 Grand Banks thing does address some of the offshore issues. Whether or not there could be industry-based sampling or industry-based observations that would highlight the magnitude of the resource that is in essentially untrawlable waters, or perhaps only areas or depths that could be fished by jigs, that would be probably the primary source of additional information about the overall distribution, oceanic distribution of Illex. So you know, those are some thoughts on both the broader term, the broader range of distribution of the resource, as well as you know, some potential ways of addressing Illex outside of the trawlable bottom types. Thanks. Is there any follow-up, James? I'm sorry if I...
Yeah, James, did you have a follow-up, or was that answer sufficient for you?
That answer is sufficient. I'm having trouble apparently with lowering my hand. Thank you.
That's okay. No, it's fine. Appreciate you asking the question, and thanks, Paul, for your answer. I'm going to go next to Greg DiDomenico. Go ahead, Greg.
Good morning, Dr. Ray. Good morning, Dr. Rago. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you fine.
Excellent. I'm trying to make my comments as brief and as direct as possible. Paul, without getting too specific, do you consider the fishing mortality rates exhibited on this fishery much lower than all of our other stocks that we manage?
Yeah, well, you know, it's very difficult for me to be brief or too specific, but yes, the short answer is it does appear to be very low based on the analyses that I've been able to examine, as well as analyses that others have conducted.
Thank you. Second question, could we go back to the issue of risk policy and how it is applied? Last year, if I recall, the change in risk policy resulted in a 8% increase of our fluke quota. Given that we are suggesting a 10% increase on the Illex quota, how does that jive with the risk policy? Because I think for me there's a little bit of a disconnect there. I'm trying to understand how we arrived at that.
Yeah, well, Jason, you want to address the risk policy from a technical standpoint. We don't have a BMSY in which we would condition the magnitude of the increase on, so we don't know where we are right now. We don't know where we would be with respect to a risk policy if we were to increase the catch to a certain level. So those are just some basic underlying technical issues with respect to figuring out some sort of comparison with fluke. And Jason, I'm sorry, I cut you off, but I know you wanted.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, and Brandon, if he's on, may be a good one to weigh in on this also. In general, I think the change to the council risk policy was focused on, when you're at a certain biomass level, then what level of risk of overfishing does the council, want to accept? With Illex, we're in a different situation where I think the risk policy still remains that the general principle is to not increase the ABC unless there's, especially good cause. And so that's the default when there's no assessment, is not to increase the ABC. Again, we're in this position of not getting, the environmental data. So, not having a lot for the council quota working group to chew on. Then, still having the research track assessment ongoing, thinking of, was there some way to, consider some change in the meantime outside of the normal processes. And that kind of led to the contract to ask Paul to analyze, what would a 10% increase, can we say something about that? And then the results are what they are.
Okay, thank you. One or two more things. So I agree with you, Jason, and I appreciate you clarifying. But I also have to say that generally speaking, and not technically speaking, the job of the SSC is to prevent the risk of overfishing and assess the risk if you overfish. I think those two questions regarding Illex, in my personal opinion, are extremely, extremely low. And so I just want to make sure that as we proceed with Illex, and I know we have a lot more work to do, but as we proceed with Illex, I really would like that to be expressed generally, and that is what's the risk that we are overfishing Illex, and what are the risks if we were to? And I think that has to be generally applied in the context of the way we manage other species. So that's just a comment. And then lastly, I would ask Jason or Dr. Rago, what do we have to do today to request the SSC the next time they convene on Illex, whether that's the next time they convene or whether that's in May of next year? How can we ensure that a proper consideration of a 40,000 metric ton quota is assessed by the SSC? Thank you.
And I think that will probably be kind of picked up in the terms of reference discussion tomorrow. And I think it will be also not, I think the point, I'm guessing the point is going to be more even, don't peg it to a number, 33,000, 40,000, et cetera. Of course, again, then the question is, who are you asking to evaluate, and just kind of as a resource constraint, given we're kind of, not relying on the center for these analyses, that further complicates things. But I think that question will be, addressed tomorrow in the general discussion of terms of reference in SSC.
Jason, do we have to wait until next May?
Um, I'm not sure. I think that would be a council leadership discussion of how some other process could work.
Thank you.
Yeah, just all of the seats on the July SSC meeting are already booked, but you know, there may be some other process that is relevant. So
Okay, thanks for that back and forth. Greg will try to figure out some way to incorporate that into the discussion. Let me see who we have next. Greg, did you have a follow-up? Your hand's still up. Okay, I've got Megan. Go ahead, Megan. You have a question for Paul and Jason, or Jason?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
All righty. The question is for Dr. Rago. So, Dr. Rago, notwithstanding any distribution patterns of any of these species, but in your opinion, how, in your general knowledge, I guess, how does the percentage of stock area fished for Illex, which according to some of the work that's been done is about 1%-ish, compare to the percent of stock area fished for other council managed species like, say, fluke, scupper, sea bass?
In broad general terms, I would say that there are relatively few areas for most finfish stocks in which the overall distribution of the resource is not fished. Now, the spatial distribution of fishing effort is, of course, the important aspect of this. I mean, we saw a little bit of this earlier with respect to fishing on surf clams and ocean quahogs. There, basically, the fishing is concentrated on the highest density areas that are known at this point. So that's kind of a central feature of spatial patterns of exploitation. If for Illex, as I've tried to say, it's not only, well, for any species really, but Illex in particular, it's important to remember that the distribution of fishing effort, the overlap of effort on top of the habitat, and its consequences for fishing mortality overall are highly dependent on the distribution of the underlying resource. So if you think of say, let's say 99% of the Illex resource was in the fishing area, and 1% was distributed over all the other habitats that were where they were observed, then it would be potentially a source of high mortality for the stock as a whole. In this instance, that's an extreme assumption. I'm not saying that's true, but I'm using it to illustrate the point that that we don't know exactly how important that 1% overlap is with respect to the subsequent dynamics and overall removal of the resource. You know, it's information on the simultaneous occurrence of high densities in other areas is an area of investigation, and I think perhaps some of the study fleet data may be useful in that regard. You know, detailed records from industry may also provide some of that additional background that will help us, help everyone to distinguish those alternative hypotheses as well as their consequences for understanding the stock dynamics. So I hope I've answered your question, Megan. If please, if something needs clarified, please ask here.
Yeah, yes, thank you. But would you agree that because generally the fleet is limited as to where it can't go any deeper because of coral zones, in general, the overlap of the fishery with the stock area is much, much smaller for Illex than it is for, say, fluke, scup, and sea bass, where, as you mentioned, the fishery essentially occurs over the entire stock area.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a safe conclusion. Again, we don't know what the importance of that. We don't know, you know, is the inshore area, how important is that for as a nursery area for the juveniles, you know, or as a migration corridor. You know, 15, 20 other hypotheses or unknowns about this that you know, we're still trying to, you know, put them all in some kind of context that allows for a more synthetic statement about stock size that would, or at least historical stock sizes that would help answer all of the questions that you have, as well as those raised by Greg with respect to magnitude of fishing mortality, and then more importantly, you know, its potential consequences for resource status.
Thank you. And I have one more question. Earlier, you mentioned, you know, the SSC's response of being kind of constrained in this past meeting to 33,000 metric tons. Based on the sentiment of the SSC, I know you can't speak for the SSC, but do you think that the SSC would have entertained higher quota levels had they been given the opportunity?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, not the sense of the discussion that occurred within the SSC meeting, as well as the other business of the SSC, was that a broader range of values, both higher and lower, would have been appreciated as far as evaluating the risk. And then at that point, you know, had that been done, then the next constraint would have been the ecological assessment, the EA, that provided the sort of the next bound on that particular discussion. But you know, again, it was something that the SSC felt was a bit constraining and so forth. But if I may, just one last point, that this whole process was highly unusual in the context of it sort of occurring in the midst of a research assessment, in the midst of you know, a recent change by the SSC in 2020 to move to 30,000 metric tons, and so it was more of an evaluation of an incremental policy adjustment, as opposed to one that fully addressed the range of risk and the consequences for stock dynamics.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Megan, for your questions. Thanks, Paul, for your answers. I think it's time to move on at this point. Let's go ahead. I'm going to come back to Jason to continue with his presentation. We still have a few items to be considered, and I'd like to try to stop around 12:30 so we can have a lunch break. But I'm going to turn to Jason now to go through the rest of his presentation. Go ahead, Jason.
Thank you. So the monitoring committee took the SSC's recommendations, recommended using that new ABC with a slightly different discard rate, just using updated discard data coming out of SBRM that's being prepped for the assessment. But it was very, 4.61% versus 4.52%. That's current. So that would make the recommended Illex specs 33,000 metric tons for an ABC, and then a similar percentage increase also accounted for discards, 31,478.7 metric tons for what's basically the quota as discussed before in terms of the IOI, DH, DAP earlier with Longfin. Due to kind of timing with MSB specs, there's a proposed rule currently open, and a letter to the above effect from the council addressed to that currently open rule, which closes tomorrow, would kind of expedite implementation. So that could just be something that could be tagged on to a motion regarding specs. So kind of back to any other questions, and then looking to the council for potential motion regarding Illex specifications. And again, like there's a little closure trip limit issue, and we can deal with that separately next. Thank you.
Okay, Jason. Yeah, thanks for that. Peter Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a question. I thought we had a pretty good round of Q&A there, but I do have a motion when you're ready.
Go ahead.
Okay, Jason, I believe that you have the motion there. Maybe you could put it up on the board and I could read it into the record. Okay. I move to adopt the following Illex specifications for 2021 through 2022. ABC equals 33,000 metric tons. IOY equals DAH equals DAP equals 31,478.7 metric tons to account for discards, and including we send NIMS a comment letter on the current MSB specification proposed rule that the final rule implement these updated specifications as soon as possible. That is my motion, sir.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'm having a little trouble seeing the screen. I think there's just something blocking part of the motion, but that's okay. Thanks for your motion. Let me ask. Let's get it back up on the screen there. Do I have a second? Dan Farnham, are you seconding that motion?
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter, did you want to speak to rationale for the motion?
Well, I think we've had a good presentation from both Jason and from Dr. Rago, explaining how we've come to this, these numbers that we have. And it's an increase over previous year's fishing, last year's fishing. So it's a recommendation from the SSC. So
yeah,
that's where the rationale comes from, the SSC.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure you had an opportunity for the record to put that out there. So based on the SSC recommendation, here we are. Is there any discussion on this motion? Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were in the same position last year, and the service was kind enough to hustle it through to get us to 30,000 last year. I'd like to hear if it's possible to get this 2021 in place for this fishing year, which is already, as Jason said earlier, 2 weeks ahead of where it was last year. And I guarantee you when the next week's landings come in, we may be ahead of it even faster because fishing is very good right now. So that's my first question. Generally speaking, I would support a portion of this motion, which is the 2021 specs, but I honestly do not support setting 2022 at 33,000 tons. And I would like to know at this point, what is the mechanism to address 2022 before May next year, knowing that we have the ability to analyze up to 40,000 tons given a presentation earlier.
Right.
I would be very interested in having a discussion much sooner in the year so it can be in place without any problems for 2022. And I would like to look at 40,000 tons at a minimum for 2022. So I only support half of this motion. Thank you.
All right. Understood, Eric. I'm going to have to turn to staff. Maybe Chris Moore or Jason can help address how that consideration might be possible for next year. I don't have the answer for you, but I'll look to staff to help me with that.
I mean, in terms of 2022, if the council said something for 2022, that can always be modified through some process. And if nothing is set for 22, then this 2021 would carry through anyway because of rollover. In terms of, again, some other, ABC for, in the meantime, again, I think that's a council leadership discussion in terms of resources would have to be dedicated towards an analysis or reanalysis also. And then there's the process questions as well. So I think that's, again, kind of a council leadership discussion of how to proceed exactly on that.
Yeah. Okay, Jason. Thank you.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it. And, I understand that 2022 could be defined as a placeholder. Nobody used the word placeholder, but I sit on pins and needles when we do this in May, and then we come to the meeting in June of whether or not it can actually be in place for any given fishing year. This fishery is happening faster and faster. Fishing has been good for, this is the 5th year in a row if the trend continues the way it is at this moment, I mean, like today. And I really think we need to address any change for 2022 much earlier than we are possibly considering it. So I'd really like to hear from leadership what the mechanism is. And honestly, if we want to have this discussion under the SSC topic tomorrow, then I suggest we table this motion and do it all tomorrow.
All right, well, let's hold off on tabling the motion at this point. Let me see if I see Mike Penny's hand up. Mike, do you have something you want to offer?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple things. So Mr. Reed's first question had to do with, what's the likelihood that we can get this in place if this motion is approved by the council? And, are there some options? We're looking at options for how we might be able to get this done, in a reasonable amount of time while the fishery is still going on. I can't promise anything because there's some unanswered questions about that, but we are, aggressively pursuing the options that we would have available to us should this motion pass. Related to the second piece of Mr. Reed's question about the 2022 ABC for 33,000 metric tons, I'll just note that, we currently have a proposed rule out for 2021, 2022 that's at 30,000. So arguably, passing this motion as written at least would provide a baseline, if it's approved, to start the 2022 fishing year at 33,000 tons rather than the current rule or the current proposed rule of 30,000 tons. But then just while I have the floor, I also agree with Mr. Reed's, request that we try to deal with this earlier in the year. Given that we are pretty late in the year and we're potentially entertaining a change mid-year to increase the quota. I would much prefer that we'd be dealing with this earlier in the fishing year to both give the fishing industry, more confidence that it'll be done at a meaningful time, but also to give our staff a little bit of a break in terms of getting this implemented as quick as possible. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. No, I appreciate that. Appreciate your thoughts. Maybe I'll put Chris Moore on the spot a little bit here to see if there's a way in our planning for next year's meetings. Do you think we can maybe make some adjustments to have this come up as earlier in the year rather than in June?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The short answer is yes. I think that we could think about and figure out how best to deal with this, including possibility of dealing with specs in April instead of June.
Yeah.
I need to, I can't commit to that now because I need to sit down and talk with Jason about, when data come into the system and when analyses could be done and all the good things that we need to support that decision. But just thinking about it, I think that that's a very likely scenario for us, just to move it to April.
Okay. All right. It's good to hear, Chris. Thanks. Eric Reed, your hand's still up. Did you have a follow-up before I go to Peter?
No, I think I've given the responses of Dr. Moore and Mr. Penny. I think I made my point, so thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Eric. Thank you. Peter Hughes, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, you made a great point, Eric, and I agree with that, and I'm appreciative of Dr. Moore and Mike Penny's responses also. I don't necessarily know that we need to do this based on Mike's response, but would it be better if the motion said I move to adopt the following Illex specifications for 2021 and default specifications for 2022? Does that make a difference? And maybe that question's for Mike Penny. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a little bit more than what I can offer advice on, Peter. I'd have to ask the folks that handle these motions and maybe Mike Penny or Jason. I don't know that there's much difference in changing the language there, but I'll turn to Garfo and to council staff to help me with that one. Sorry, I can't answer your question for you.
Yeah, this is Mike Penny. I'm just not clear what Mr. Hughes means by and default specifications for 2022, because the plain, kind of interpreting that as he said it, there was no numbers associated with what those default specifications would be. So I'm not clear what is being requested in terms of default. As I said, we have a proposed rule in the street now that would set default specs for 2022 at 33,000 tons or 30,000 tons. I interpret the current motion as a request to change those 2022 specs to 33,000 tons, understanding that, at some point early next year, there might be another action that would look at increasing it further. But anyway, I'll stop there in case Mr. Hughes has a clarification.
Yeah, no, I think I'm right on track with you, Mike. And Peter, I think that based on the discussion that we had about revisiting this earlier in the year next year, if we were to set the 2021 and 2022 specs at 33, and we had a conversation in April, there could be modifications to 2022, but I don't know that. I don't know what a default measure really means. Maybe you can clarify, but I think moving forward with the motion in front of us sets the stage for the next 2 years, or at least this year and next year. And then if we're going to revisit it in April, as Chris Moore mentioned, as long as the information and the data are available, we could always make modifications if need be for the 2022 season. But at least it gives us something to start with for 2022.
No, and that's perfect, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the advice that we've been given here today. Like I said, when I started out, I wasn't sure that I needed to do this. So I'm good with the way the motion reads right now. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. Thank you. Any other discussion on the motion? Anyone from the public have anything they want to offer to the motion? Any comment? All right, seeing none, I'm going to read the motion into the record, and then I'm going to see what the council would like to do with this. I move to adopt the following Illex specifications for 2021-2022. ABC equals 33,000 metric tons. IOY equals DAH equals DAP equals 31,478.7 metric tons to account for discards, including sending NIMS a comment letter on the current MSB specifications proposed rule that the final rule implemented these updated specifications as soon as possible. Is there any opposition to the motion? Any opposition? Okay, seeing no opposition, the motion passes based on consent with no opposition. Are there any abstentions? I see one hand for one abstention. National Marine Fisheries Service is abstaining from the motion. So as long as we can put that in the record, I think we're good to go. Okay, thanks everyone for your discussion on that topic. Jason, I'm going to come back to you. I think we have one more thing, maybe one or two more things to cover. I know you said you had the trip limit issue next. So go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you. So the other thing related to specs, again, an executive order consideration, similar to the Butterfish issue, there had been some AP concern expressed in the past that with a 10,000 pound post-closure incidental trip limit for Illex, you could get some regulatory discarding. We took a similar look at observed longfin trips in the last 3 years occurring after the closures of Illex. And higher catches in that trip limit were relatively infrequent. Of the discards that did occur, 75% of those discards were reported as market-driven in terms of the captains reporting to observers why they were discarding. So again, there was, I'd say, limited interest by AP members in kind of opening this up before the Illex permit action and research track assessment worked their way through. And so the monitoring committee recommended no changes. Similarly, also with other actions ongoing, but can certainly continue to monitor to see if, again, if something changed and all of a sudden there are a lot of Illex discards and longfin trips, given that's where generally the concern is and some overlap there, this issue could be revisited. But monitoring committee recommended no changes at this time. So I can either take questions. No action is needed. If there was a motion, this would be the time to entertain it.
All right, thanks, Jason. So are you saying that a motion is not necessary unless there's a change for trip limits?
Correct. And the monitoring committee recommended no changes.
Okay. All right. Anyone have any questions for Jason regarding trip limits? Any questions? Anyone from the public or the audience have any questions for Jason regarding the the discussion on trip limits? Is there any interest in a motion by any member of the council at this point to change the trip limits? Doug, I saw your hand come up. Did you have something you wanted to offer? Doug Crystal? Okay, maybe not. That maybe just, you might have just clicked on it by accident. Okay, Jason, I don't see any questions. I don't see any hands. So I would assume that the council has no interest in changing trip limits and would go forward with the recommendations from the monitoring committee. So I think we're good to go on this one.
Okay, thank you. So the last issue was, so on the brief materials, staff, just in matter of course of kind of trying to look out in the future and think about potential upcoming issues. There's still some uncertainty regarding the final outcomes of the ongoing Illex research track assessment and the Illex permit amendment. Recall NIMS expressed some concern back when action was taken. And so, an additional control date could proactively increase the flexibility of the council for considering capacity-related management measures once the outcomes of the assessment amendment are finalized, and alert fishery participants that additional measures to address capacity might be considered pending those outcomes. Again, there's no action necessary here unless the council wants to take action. There's more council staff thinking, okay, let's, if the amendment ended up being disapproved or, there was a lawsuit or whatever, council staff imagine the council may want to revisit this issue. So it's not changing any past action. It's just, if there was some hiccup with that action being implemented, then kind of wouldn't, council wouldn't be caught flat-footed with in terms of folks, wondering, what may happen next, how history may be treated, et cetera. So that was a thought here. No count, it's just, the council's sense of this. It was just a potential issue that staff wanted to raise.
All right, thanks, Jason. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions for Jason regarding the control date? So Jason, you're suggesting, well, maybe you're not suggesting, but you're putting it out there that it, if the council wishes, it could establish a new control date for historical purposes in perhaps establishing permit or control over the fishery to some degree, right? I mean, that's where you're going with this.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say a new control date. I'd say more an additional control date. Because again, I'm not suggesting the council would want to undo anything it had done to date. It's just more kind of a placeholder pending whatever the outcome is of the Illex action and the research track assessment.
Right. Is there a control date already set at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it would be the existing control date used in the council decision for the Illex permit action.
Right.
And I would just want to double check on that. But yeah, there is an existing control date.
There's already an existing control date.
Yeah.
So are you thinking that a new control date, which would be, I guess, the way I understand control dates as they work, it would be when it would be published in the register? That would be it would be a notification of a new control date? Is that what we're talking about here? Or just a recognition of the previous control date?
I think, if there was a hiccup in that action and the council had to kind of start from scratch, then, it is to have an additional new control date on the books. As
see.
just another option as a council, considered what to do next.
Right, because the council's not bound to use the control date. It just puts a placeholder basically in the record for
Correct.
use if necessary. Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that for me. I wanted to make sure I was clear. I have a few hands up. Let me go to Chris Moore first, and then Dan, I'll come back to you, and Peter, I'll come back to you in a second. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to emphasize what Jason was trying to do here, and that is basically giving the council a heads up. And we don't expect a decision on a control date today, but just, putting it out there that may be a possibility in the future, given, what he's laid out for you today regarding these potential outcomes. And again, we're not expecting a long discussion or picking a control date today, but just, again, a heads up.
Yeah. Okay. It's just putting everybody on notice, basically, that it might be something that we might want to consider for a future meeting.
Exactly.
I got it. Okay, Chris, thank you. Dan Farnham, go ahead, Dan.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand where Jason's coming from here, but I think we might be jumping the gun on this one. Personally, I think I'd rather wait to see what the outcome of the last action is. It's under review by GARFO or NIMS right now, and also see what the results of the track assessment are. That we're going to get the results, I hope, in 22. I'm just looking at my notes from the last presentation here, or this presentation, about the status of this stock. All I have highlighted here is high abundance, low exploitation, a small fishing footprint. Everybody's talking about increasing quotas, hopefully, or possibly going to a 40,000 metric ton quota for 2022. These are all big decisions. That's a 33% increase over 2020's quota. I think we should wait and let the dust settle from everything else, and then consider a control date at a later date. Thank you.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Dan. Based on Chris's point and Jason's points, I think basically Jason was trying to just put the council on notice that this is something that we may want to talk about down the road, but not necessarily picking a date or deciding on a control date today. So I appreciate your thoughts. This fishery is changing drastically over the last few years, and it might be better just to see how things shake out. And as you mentioned, let the dust settle before we make any more big decisions on this type of action. Peter Hughes, I have you next, and then Kate Wilkie. Go ahead, Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did send Jason and Mary a motion in regards to this. And I'm probably going to change some of the rationale in that motion, Jason. You should have it.
Did that motion go to my email?
Yeah, I went to your email.
Okay.
And Mary.
So Peter, let me ask you while Jason's putting it up. I haven't seen the motion, but you feel that a motion is necessary right now to establish a control date?
Well, and I'll ask you that question, Mr. Chairman, that, my motion is very simple. It's just to refer the Illex control date to the Mackerel Squid Butterfish committee for deliberations.
Okay.
The committee has not had an opportunity to discuss this yet, and maybe that would be helpful, that the committee could put forward a recommendation to the full council, being it would be a committee motion coming out of the committee. That's all.
Okay, well, let me ask Chris. Is that something that we could, it may not have to be in the form of a motion, Peter. We might be able to just agree to that. But let me ask Chris Moore if that's something that we could work into our work plan for this year.
Yeah.
Chris, do you have any thoughts
Thank you.
on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that I don't think we need a motion today, and certainly we can work it into the work plan for whatever time we have this year, and certainly into 2022's implementation plan. So yeah, I think we have an understanding of what we want the committee to look at, and certainly at this point, I don't think we need a motion, formal motion.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So Peter, based on your comment about bringing a control date topic to the committee, is there anybody that objects at this time? Kate Wilkie, I see your hand up, but I'm assuming you're not objecting to that. You can leave your hand up if you'd like. I'm looking for other members of the council that would object to having the committee discuss a control date moving forward. Dan Farnham, are you objecting to that conversation?
Mr. Chairman, no objection, but I mean, how about some information from the AP to start too, or in conjunction, or I mean, don't forget we can go down that avenue also.
Of course.
Yeah,
I think an AP discussion and a committee discussion is warranted on this issue. Maybe after new information is available, or any further information is available, I'm going to lean on staff to figure out how that would work best. But of course, the AP would certainly be welcome in providing some thoughts on that as well, Dan. So thanks for bringing that up. I'm gonna put that on staff, on Chris and Jason to make that work. So with that said, Peter, I think your thoughts, seeing no opposition to what it is you described, and as chair of that committee, I'm going to lean on you to work with Chris and Jason to try to get something put together when it's most necessary, or not necessary, but when it's most relevant for that discussion. And we'll wait for feedback from you as a committee chair during an upcoming meeting at some point, maybe in the fall or in the winter.
Great, and I appreciate everybody's input here. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. All right, thanks, Peter. Anyone else have anything they want to bring to the table? Jason, I'm looking at my notes that you guys presented for me or prepared for me. It looks like that was the last issue on the list under this agenda item. Is there anything else you want to bring forth at this time?
I think we're good. Also, I don't know if Doug Crystal is still on the call. I always like to check with my Garfield counterpart. I think that wraps it up for monitoring committee and MSB specs things that we needed to cover today. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I saw Doug's hand go up earlier and then it went down. Doug, if you're there, is there anything else that we can do? Anything else you need from the council at this time on these issues?
No, Jason's covered it, and I apologize for the mistaken button hit earlier.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, no worries. It's all good. Okay, so it sounds like we've covered this item on the agenda. We're a little bit over our time, but I think what I'd like to do, we have a 1:30 start time for the unmanaged commercial landings report from Julia, and then I know that there's an interest on the EFP on thread herring. So that starts at 1:30. So let's break between now and 1:30. We'll come back at 1:30 and get the report from Julia and then talk about the EFP. Enjoy your lunch, everybody. Take a little break. And if you can stay online, that's probably easier. But if you have to jump off when you get back, just check in with staff to make sure your audio is working well. And I'll see you back here in 45 minutes at 1:30. Thank you.